My name is Sadie Bolze, and I'm with the American Grass-Fed Association. I get the pleasure to talk to different producers about what they're doing, why they do it, and all over the United States. And today we are blessed with the presence of Brett Chedzoy out of the Northeast, New York specifically. And we were going to talk today about silvopasturing and his grazing style that he's using with his beautiful cows. So without further ado, Brett, do you mind kind of giving everybody a brief background on you and how you came to be in the regenerative community and then what you're doing with your cows?
Oh, that's such a short story, Sadie. Thank you for the invite to join you. And obviously, Sadie and I know each other from before. She wouldn't have pronounced my last name correctly. I'm a regional extension forester with Cornell University. And in addition to all the fun stuff that I get to do, talking to people about their woodlands and agroforestry interests, our family also owns and operates Angus Glen farms here in Watkins Glen, New York. We're a large cow-calf operation. We graze a little over 100 mama cows and their calves on about 600 acres, and about half of that acreage is what we think of as silvopastures, meaning there's some mix of trees and forage out there.
Okay. And that would be your raw definition of silvopasturing. It's just trees and mixed with pasture land.
Yeah, and a lot of our pasture lands, especially here in the Northeast, already have trees usually mixed in, but we um, talk very specifically today about silvopasturing to distinguish it from our long history of what we call woodland grazing. It's hard to find an old farm woodlot here in any part of the Northeast that doesn't have the remnants of being used for livestock in the past. And notice I just said livestock, I didn't say livestock grazing, because a lot of our farm woodlots still have the old barbed wire fences or page wire fences. Some even have stone wall and stump fences around them. And I think historically, all of these small family farms, many of which were dairies or kind of diversified mixed livestock and maybe some crops, the farm woodlot really became sort of the de facto sacrifice paddock on the farm, where the animals were dumped and kind of left there to be out of sight and out of mind. And the farm woodlot became the area where you put the cows when it was too hot or too cold or too muddy, or the fields were planted. And what we slowly came to realize, and this is going back at least 60, 70, even 80 years ago, this consciousness of in this very effectively branded paradigm of keep the cows out of the woods. That was like the first thing they taught me almost 40 years ago when I showed up in forestry school infancy, was like, thou shall not put cows in the woods. And part of that was that here in the United States, we inherited a European forestry model and mindset where they had basically cleared and lost much of their forest land. So your little community woods or your royal woods, that was a very kind of like special part of the landscape, and you treated it as forest or as woods. You didn't go in there and do multiple use things, including grazing animals. And all of our early forestry is the youngest profession in the United States. It was officially recognized in the year 1900, and all of the early American foresters and conservationists and people like Aldo Leopold were inherited this European model of forestry. But also we were seeing that in essence we were overgrazing or over impacting with livestock our beautiful farm woodlands to death. And I mean, we're all aware as grazers the potentially great things that our animals can do that work in our favor, but we're also aware of the things, the sort of destructive and damaging behavior that animals can have too. And putting livestock in areas with trees is nothing new, but historically it's really only been about the last 25, maybe 30 years that we've even been using the word silvopasturing. And that's a word that doesn't roll off the tip of the tongue, and it means nothing to the person on the street, but it is the internationally recognized term for this symbiotic and synergistic combination of growing forages and trees and livestock together in a mutually beneficial way versus a antagonistic way. We haven't come up with really a better term for it yet, although I would welcome anybody to explain it in ways that make sense, both to themselves and the others that they're trying to explain this to. If you want to call it, you know, tree grazing or grazing with trees, or just be aware that woodland grazing is like, if you say that to a forester, the hair is going to bristle on the back of their neck to hear like, no, don't put cows in the woods. Now, I think foresters have come a long ways in understanding the differences between silvopasturing and what we all think of as like a negative or potentially not appropriate use of our woodlands. Where we've been doing this the longest in places like the southeastern pinelands or the western rangelands with ponderosa pine, lodgepole pine, those trees would be vulnerable to the same destructive impacts as our high quality mixed hardwood forests here in the greater northeastern part of the United States too. But if you go out there and let your cattle girdle the bark off the loblolly pine or the lodgepole pine, it's a bummer that you damaged that tree and potentially killed that tree, but that tree was probably worth a few dollars, if that. Whereas if your animals go and girdle or rub the bark off of your high value hard maple tree or oak tree or cherry tree or walnut tree, that's a tree that could potentially be worth hundreds of dollars. And so there's a lot at stake here. And where we are in the upstate part of New York, it's considered to be the most valuable hardwood forest region in the world. I worked for years in international forestry, and I always thought these faraway exotic forests where they grew ebony and mahogany and teak and rosewood were these even more magical forests. And I went and I worked there for almost a decade, and I realized that, yeah, other parts of the world have nice trees too, but the overall prevalence of those trees and the value per acre hectare isn't equivalent to what we enjoy here in the parts of New York and Pennsylvania, where we just seem to have this perfect mix of climate and soils and or tree species that just generate really high quality woodlands. So if we're going to use our woodlands for these other agroforestry uses, such as silvopasturing, we need to be attentive to what the potential risks are and then do things in a way that we're minimizing or eliminating those risks.
So you use the word girdling. So that would be rubbing the bark off the trees or essentially damaging the tree to killing it, correct? Girdling.
Correct.
Okay.
There's multiple ways, though, that livestock can be detrimental to the health of not just individual trees, but our farm woodlands as a whole. One is, I mean, a real obvious way is the physical damage to trees, whether it's, and you think about like in the springtime, the sap is flowing and many of these tree species, like we're just coming out of maple syrup season here now, but it'll be 4th of July before the bark really starts to tighten up on both our maple trees as well as many of our other hardwood trees now. So animals don't necessarily need to chew the bark off. And it's surprising how an animal with only one set of teeth, like a bovine, can still very effectively chew the bark off of trees. We've watched our heifers totally strip the bark uh, from the ground 5 feet up on many a young tree. And it's not that they do that all the time or do it just like that's not their go-to thing. It's there's too many variables to really say how and why and when it happens, but spring is a particularly vulnerable time of the year for especially younger trees. Think of trees that are maybe only a few inches in diameter, maybe 10, 15, perhaps up to 20 years old. They have a kind of a juvenile bark versus like a kind of a coarser, thicker bark, but they um, in the springtime, the animals only may need to go over there and be trying to rub some of the winter hair coat off or itch the scratch the itch from the lice or whatever still bothering them as they're coming out of winter to debark portions of that tree. And if they take too much bark off the tree is going to die. Uh, but even if they only damage a portion of the tree stem, it's like, if we put a big cut on our arm, we're probably going to survive that and maybe even recover that, but it still didn't help us that we had this big injury on our body, and trees are no different. So some of the other maybe lesser obvious ways that too much animal impact can harm our trees is soil compaction and pugging, particularly in soft ground conditions where many trees, especially hardwoods, have their most important roots are what we call the shallow fine feeder roots that are typically within a few inches of the soil surface. And versus say a pine tree that tends to have deep tap roots. Now some hardwoods have deep tap roots too, but pretty much all have these fine feeder roots. And those feeder roots are the ones that if we're overly compacting the soil or continuously mechanically damaging those roots, it's like death by a thousand cuts. So that's one of the ways that um, I think many of us fail to recognize that uh, we have caused chronic stress to those trees or to that wooded area. And an analogy that I often use with my farmer audience is that if they're not doing a good job of managing their pasture or their hayfield or their crop field, or for that matter, their lawn or their garden, they're going to see the symptoms of that quite quickly. They're going to see perhaps more weeds or more bare soil or less productivity. And once you recognize that you've done something damaging or degrading to that, you can often, though fairly quickly, reverse that process or reverse those symptoms. You can let it rest longer, you can fertilize it, you could reseed it, you could do other things that will help that area recover. If you beat up on your forest or your farm woodland, on the other hand, it may be many years, it could be a decade or more before you start to see the decline in the trees. You'll see dieback in the crowns. You'll see sparser foliage in the trees' crowns. You might see some wind throw because of compromised root systems. You will certainly see some quality loss on the inside of the tree. That is, once the tree is harvested, you would realize you had decay or what we call mineralization in the stem, all of which are symptoms from things like chronic soil compaction. And once you see those symptoms, though, it's a one-way street. You're not going to reverse to any practical extent what's already happening there. And so if you mess up your garden, you say oops and you start over again the next season. If you mess up your woods, it's a big oops, and it could take you many decades to uh, basically get back to where you were.
Right. So, and that's fascinating to me because we're Northwest Nebraska in the pine trees. And I guess I have yet to notice the cows do much to the trees other than just use them for shade. Um, so then what grazing style are you doing with your cows to protect the trees? What's that look like?
Yeah, silvopasturing, Sadie, is, I believe, synonymous with adaptive rotational grazing.
Okay.
And I'm not going to give you any precise rules of thumb of just what that rotation looks like, but the adaptive part is obviously very important there, where, again, we need to recognize that trees react to chronic stress or just stress differently than herbaceous plants. So we need to anticipate the problems before they happen, because once it becomes obvious to us that we've pushed the envelope too far, it's too late, quite honestly. And you're talking about the pines that are native to where you are. Different types of trees have different strengths and weaknesses or vulnerabilities and resilience, so to speak, to grazing interactions with livestock. And typically your conifers, especially pines, we would think of as more resistant to maybe less than optimal or less than ideal management than say trees like a favorite hardwood tree here in the Northeast. And some people listening to this are going to shudder because I know it can be kind of obnoxious, invasive. At our ranch in Argentina, it's like the tree from hell. It's a honey locust. And if you get to interview my friend Austin Unruh later to talk about their work with putting trees back into treeless pasture areas, that's one of their favorite trees. Why they like honey locust so much? Because it's a awesome edible mass producing tree. Uh, but the honey locust has paper thin bark, even as a kind of a middle-aged tree. Now it also has some horrible, horrible thorns on it, which is why I call it the tree from hell. And the reason it becomes invasive in areas where it's not a native tree, like in central Argentina, there's pasture lands have just been completely lost to honey locusts because the cows preferentially consume the pods. The pods are fairly high sugar, they're fairly nutritious to the cattle, and then those hard seeds are passing out the back end with a fertilizer package and off to the races. And if that land is not being well grazed at that point forward, pretty soon it's a bamboo thicket with thorns. So, but honeysuckle, or honey locust rather, is a tree that the animals only need to look at the wrong way and the bark could fall off even a decade or two after planting it. And that's not to say that we still can't go in there and do business as usual grazing. We need to do good grazing. We can't just dump the cows in there and kind of forget about them, because bored and restless animals become destructive animals. Whereas if we're out there moving them once a day, every other day, maybe every 3 days, we're paying attention to what the grazing behavior is. We're paying attention to there's enough forage there for the animals to meet their nutritional needs. All is going to be good, especially during what we would think of as the normal grazing season, like this time of the year through till whenever our stockpiles run out in the fall. But if I put my animals in that same area in February and we're bale grazing, and maybe we're only moving the animals half as often or less often because they got hay there to eat, that's when you would see animals potentially go over there. And of course, they're also itchy because of lice and other, they got their shaggy winter coats on. They're looking for any scratch and post they can find. And your young trees that you poured all this love and money into are the perfect. Plus, you put them in a nice straight row typically that they can walk right down and not just destroy one or two trees, but the whole row of trees or the whole block of trees.
Right. So now, is there a way then, you were talking about the spring being the most vulnerable for trees in the Northeast anyway? Is there a way that I mean, are you not grazing the trees any time of the year? Or are your cows in the trees majority of the time?
Arch, so we can potentially graze in any of our silvopasture areas any time of the year.
Okay.
And now that said, there's, I think a big part of adaptive grazing management is watching the 10-day forecast. And I say that kind of jokingly, but you can avoid so many train wrecks if you just, and I think anybody who farms, especially grazers, we're all weather app junkies. I mean, I have my phone stuck in my face all day, but I promise you it's not looking at social media or whatever people use. I mean, I probably do enough of that too, but it's just like you live and die with the forecast. And so if I see that, we've had lots of rain lately and the ground is pretty waterlogged and we're going to get 2 fresh inches of rain tonight, then I'm not going to move the animals into the lowest, wettest, soggiest area where I have a lot of trees there that I know are not going to be happy if the cows are in there making a bowl of mud soup. I'm going to try to at least keep them out of the trees and ideally get them onto the higher, drier spots. So we can, we can't lock ourselves into necessarily such a rigid rotation that we can't pivot and move somewhere that we're just in adverse weather. You're always going to do some damage somewhere.
Yeah.
But and mud is one of our biggest challenges here in the soggy Northeast. I say that very respectfully because I know that in a lot of other parts of the country right now, people would love to see a little mud and a little rain. But and it's not that we don't have plenty of dust and dry periods too, but we can do not only what's best for our soils and for our trees and our forage plants, we can also do what's best for the animals. Changing topic a little bit, one of the types of silvopastures that we have on our farm are what we call our living barns. And these are our mixed conifer plantations that we were planting 35 to 40 years ago, not thinking at that point in time. So the reason I planted trees on our farm for much of my college years was not because I was like, someday I'm going to be a big beef cattle person and do all this cool silvopasturing. It was so that I grew up on a horse farm doing small square bales, and I wanted to absolutely try to plant as many of the hay fields to trees as possible, so I'd hopefully never have to do a small square bale again. And I wasn't, both my parents, my mom's family are Kansas wheat farmers, my dad's family are farmers from this neck of the woods. It wasn't really in their blood to see perfectly good farm fields get planted trees, but they loved their oldest child who was a forester and just wanted to plant trees everywhere. And I wasn't here long enough to fully carry through that threat, but we did plant a good chunk of our farm in the late 80s, early 90s, and the areas that we plant the conifers versus hardwoods like walnut and black locust, those areas now have become like hugely important for us because when we again are watching that 10-day forecast and we see that the polar vortex is on its way or the blizzard of 026 is coming in later in the week, we can start moving the juggernaut towards one of those spruce fir pine plantations that, despite the name, we don't use it, we don't treat it as a barn, and that the animals are not locked down in there for extensive periods of time. In fact, the only time they go into these living barn areas is when they have to ride out the ugliest winter weather for, sometimes it's only a day or two, sometimes it might be a little longer, but we can keep these areas in reserve with a little better hay. Typically they're on high and dry ground. They're also pretty protected all around the outside by larger wooded and silvopasture areas, and there's some reliable winter water source. And I can, someday when AI allows us to freely communicate with our animals, I'm confident that my cows are going to tell me that they would much rather be in that living barn than locked down in the barn or the frozen muddy barnyard
Oh yeah.
any time of the year, but especially when they do perhaps need that bit more relief. And our cattle, but we used to have a lot of sheep and goats as well. The cattle eventually replaced them. We're talking about ruminant animals that have built-in anaerobic digesters, and as long as we're doing our part by keeping their bellies full of decent quality feed, they can generate typically all the heat that they need to withstand the most brutal of winter temperatures. But on those handful of days a year where this blistering ice like snow is coming in horizontally and the wind is gusting 30-40 miles an hour, they thank us for putting them in a spot that they can at least get their faces and ears out of the uh, driving snow and whipping winds. And it it's just those little things that I think make our animals a little more comfortable and a little happier, and happy animals make for happy farmers. I've proven to myself, or I should say the cows have proven to me many times, that minus 25, minus 30 wind chill, we had one day of minus 30 wind chill here this winter, that, I go out, I worry about the cows, I go out there and they're just laying there around the round bales chewing their cud looking at me like, what, like, what are you here for? It's like, go back and get in your house, dummy. We're fine. So but on those really brutal days, I sleep a lot better knowing that they can get to those wooded shelter areas if they choose to do so. And we rarely see them actively seek out those areas, but there are a handful of times of the year that, they'll go hunker down for a while in the woods. I don't think we get quite the wind chills here in upstate New York, ironically, that you get out where you are, but we have a lot more humidity here in the winter too. And it's just, we use the word bone chilling for a reason.
Oh yeah. You guys can get pretty miserable. Pretty easy, it seems like. You guys get cold.
Yeah, cold and wet, and that's cold and wet and mud to boot. And, that's kind of the perfect storm for stressing animals out. So that's another thing that we really like about our living barns, is that they're in essence self-cleaning, and they're also appreciating, versus like if I build a nice new NRCS spec pole barn for several $100,000, that is depreciating. Plus I'm going to eventually pay taxes on it here when it goes on the tax roll after a 10-year grace period, good old New York State.
Yeah.
So, our living barns, we don't have to clean them out. And again, we're keeping these areas in reserve for when we really need them, much like we keep the silvopastures. I said at the beginning that about half of our we're grazing almost 700 acres now. About half of that is in some form of silvopasture. Well, that's where the rotation also comes in really nice, because you can again see that heat dome event is coming up, or the dog days of summer, and because you kind of know where your animals are moving towards, you can put them there when the heat stress is going to be at its worst, versus like there's times that we're hovering in the 70s, maybe even low 80s here in New York, and we know that heat stress is right around the corner sometimes. So we might pivot the animals back in a different direction and then keep those areas in reserve for, and give it another week or two, and then you start shooting back up into the 90s with 80% humidity, and that's where the animals are definitely thanking you for giving them access to the silvopasture areas where they can stay quite a bit cooler and more comfortable. The living barns, because again the animals are not in there frequently, you still have to graze them a little bit. They may or may not be part of our normal paddock rotation, but typically you have a lot of like pine needles and leaf litter built up under that, and the animals love to bed on that when you get that really nasty winter weather. Now they might be already standing in 6 to 12 inches of wet snow, but if they're moving in there just before the polar vortex hits and maybe you got an inch of rain just before they moved in there, they've got in essence clean fresh bedding in there to lay on, and of course they've got their round bales sitting there ready for them too, which gives them more clean fresh bedding. I think that, not to get off topic, but we've been bale grazing for over 20 years, and I think that that ability to go back and bed on the recently grazed off round bales that's a huge unspoken or under recognized benefit in my experience. We always leave 1 to 2 of the previously bale grazed paddocks open, and the cows will walk however far they have to walk. And it's kind of like, I don't know, you might not be old enough to remember the old Far Side cartoons, but like, I think of it as like, 30 fat cows trying to like perch on one little bale spot just so they can have the fresh bedding. But I have pictures of cows, and, there's like 10 cows on this spot and 8 cows on that spot, and maybe 9 cows on another spot, but they're only laying down on where those round bales were that they recently grazed off.
So then, and that so leads perfectly into my next question of, with your bale grazing, if you're doing that amongst the trees, whether that be in your living barns or out in a pasture that has trees in it, I mean, how close would you want to put a bale to a tree? Because the litter left behind is going to help with regrowth, but at the same time, is it going to create too much compaction that you're going to damage a tree? I mean, is it more beneficial or less beneficial to bale graze close to trees? Simply.
There's trade-offs, no doubt about it. Now, in the dead of winter, and by dead of winter here in New York, I'm talking really about probably up until mid-March, but we can have sap flow much earlier in the winter when that bark. So if you get warm, sunny days in the 40s, you have to be cognizant that that tree bark is now more vulnerable than it was when it was 15 degrees the week before. We like to bale graze as much as we can in the winter in our silvopasture areas, especially when we have a good old fashioned winter like we did this winter and even really the winter before, because the ground is frozen. That is, if we have any real upsides to grazing here in the frozen north, it's that we typically have a lot of frost in the ground in the winter, which allows us to do things that maybe folks that don't get a lot of frost in their ground in the wintertime can't. This winter, we were able to bale graze in some lower lying areas that in most winters don't freeze up enough or long enough to really do any effective bale grazing in there. And one of the reasons we like to bale graze in our silvopasture areas is that in your silvopastures, it's harder to control the noxious plants, the non-native thorny invasive shrubs and things like goldenrod and but really the like multiflora rose and honeysuckle, those would be kind of common problematic plants or nuisance plants in the silvopasture areas. Now, if those plants are overrunning your treeless pasture, you can go in there with a brush hog or the spray tank and do something about it. In your silvopastures, you have all these objects in the way. So the livestock impact is really about your only option. I would argue it's probably your most effective and cost-effective option to deal with the nuisance plants. And every place that we drop a round bale, like in the patch of multiflora rose or blackberry canes or barberry patches, what we call soft brush, if you drop the round bale in the patch of like 15-foot tall buckthorn, guess what? The cows aren't going to do much there to control the buckthorn. But if you drop the bale in the middle of the thorny canes, and now you put 20 cows around that round bale for several hours devouring that round bale in that 30-foot diameter impact zone, you've created mathematically about 1.5 million pounds of density per acre. That is a lot more than we can achieve even under the best mob grazing during the grazing season. Now, we should still strive to up our grazing density during at least one rotation in the summer months as well, because you have other plants like say goldenrod that in goldenrod, in my experience, you have to be at a level of at least several 100,000 pounds per acre of density to really have any appreciable impact on later summer goldenrod growth. Um, but in the wintertime, the plants that aren't hiding under the ground, like the woody shrubs, those plants we can really put a beat down on the bad brush when we drop those bales. There's a forester friend of mine at Yale, Joe Orifice, who I heard him call it bale bombs once, and I've adopted that and used. So we do a lot of bale bombing in the wintertime in our silvopastures. And the other upside to that is that we're putting typically a lot of fertility and viable seed in these areas where we want to increase the amount of forage that's available to our animals. But all the time, we have to be ready to pull the animals out of there if we start to sense that there's conditions that would make not just younger trees, but any of the trees more vulnerable to that presence of having the cows or whatever animals in there. Typically in a silvopasture, and this is really getting off into the forestry weeds, but typically all of the trees in a farm woodlot or any ranch or farm woodland are going to be pretty similar in age, and that's just because of the shade tolerance of those tree species. They basically all started out as baby trees around the same time, and the trees that you see there today, however many decades later, are the trees that are still basically winning the race for the sky. Now, you may have some fairly large trees and some much smaller trees. For the most part, though, those trees are all the same age. It's just the smaller trees are the ones that were not capturing as much sunlight and producing as much wood through photosynthesis as their larger neighbors. You can have multiple age classes in the woods, but it's not how most of our farm woodlands grow and develop. So we don't want to make the erroneous assumption that the small trees growing in amongst the bigger trees are like the next up and coming younger trees. They are more typically probably the suppressed and loser trees or runt trees that it's just, and that's in essence how we create silvopastures here, is that we call out or thin out those poor doing trees to reallocate that sunlight down to the soil surface where we can grow productive forages with it instead. So I call it do I want to grow forages or do I want to grow firewood in my woods? And if I want to have productive silvopastures and grow forages, then I need to thin out or call out. You could think of thinning as weeding, weed out again, the lower quality, poor doing, like overtop type trees, and everything from there down, including often we're starting out with like an invasive shrub layer under our farm woods. So for just forestry objectives, we only really need to focus the thinning at the upper canopy level. With silvopasture, we have to go one step further and remove all of the interfering plants, interfering meaning that they're stealing that sunlight that we want to get closer to the forage layer. We need to remove those plants too. And typically those plants are plants that they're just hanging on there, or they've come into a disturbed farm woodland, like invasive brush, invasive shrubs. That's usually a symptom of, much like weeds in the pasture, it's a symptom of disturbance. Trees die from old age, they die from storm damage, they die from insect and disease, they die from harvesting. Every time that there's one of those disturbances, human made or natural, more sunlight is reaching the ground and then things start to grow. But the things that grow today are typically fall into the like bad category versus the good category. Part of the reason that we grow invasive shrubs in our woods versus baby oaks and maples is white-tailed deer browsing, but that's another topic for another time. And it's livestock that helps us kind of re-level the playing field there, where we can keep things in a healthier, more desirable vegetative state of herbaceous plants, some woody plants too. And silvopastures, depending on your perspective, they can look kind of messy and chaotic. It's not like a beautiful pasture of orchard grass or pick whatever your favorite forages are. I mean, there's a lot more plant diversity. Typically, there's a lot more um, structural diversity within the first few feet of the ground because you do have these tall weeds and these woody shrubs, as well as your more classic forage type plants like your grasses and forbs. And it really provides, I think, optimal nutrition for the animals. If our cool season pastures here and where our farm is in New York are dominated by orchard grass. Now it's orchard grass and many other things. And I know if you go a little further south, it might be tall fescue and other things. If you go further west, it's going to be something else, maybe brome and but orchard grass is what really dominates our pastures here. And yet when you start throwing in a kind of a light to modest overstory of trees, that seems to encourage the growth of other plants that typically don't survive the full exposure to sun and uh, hot, droughty conditions in July and August. Silvopasture understories are cooler, moister, more conducive environments, I think, for a greater diversity of plants to grow. And the grazing animals will definitely benefit from that. I mean, I think everybody listening loves to observe the grazing behavior of their animals, and we realize they don't just generally put their head down and start munching on whatever's right in front of them. They're wafting their noses over different things, and it's like they kind of skip over this plant and then they go to the next and take a bite of that. Whenever we move our animals into a fresh silvopasture paddock, it's like you could take it to the bank that they are going to probably walk over and spend the first 5 minutes nibbling at low hanging tree branches and some of the woody shrubs that are within reach. And they're in essence self-medicating whatever it is that they're sensing that they're getting from that woody browse. And after they've had a dozen bites off of that, then they turn their attention to the herbaceous plants. But there's something in that uh, oak foliage or that pine bough or that viburnum bush that and who knows what it is, but there's some trace elements or micronutrients in there that they just know is good for them or that they need, and they they get their little fill of it and then they go back to eating the usual stuff.
So someone that would want to get started silvopasturing, rather than waiting for the disaster to happen, and when I say disaster, I mean, trees getting damaged. I guess what tips or steps would you give someone that wanted to get started down this route?
Yeah, folks are interesting. So many of our farms here in the east, but I would say the west as well, have some portion of the ranch or farm that's covered with the trees are already there. And that is so I'm of the mindset that if I'm paying taxes on it, I'm going to figure out a way to graze it. And that's kind of partly what led us into using and our farm was over 50% covered with woods when we started out. But my comfort level with silvopasturing actually started much earlier through our experiences in Argentina. We can talk about those another time. But anybody today with some wooded portions of what they have available to graze, the first thing you're going to have to realize is that you're going to have to probably reduce the density of those trees to some degree. So I simplify it into, I jokingly call it the 3 easy steps. Maybe not so easy, but the first is we have to reduce tree density, and I'll explain how that happens in a moment. And then the next step is that we have to get forages established. And a lot of times what's already in the soil seed bank is going to suffice, but there are cases where we may want to go in and do some supplemental seeding. And then the third step is keeping in mind what we were discussing earlier about you can't just hook on the bat wing and go mow your weed problem away or your brush problem away. You're going to have to use your livestock as your four-legged workforce to continuously and gradually shift it from this chaotic mix of brush and weeds and grass and clover and everything else to more grass and clover and less brush and weeds. And that's a year-round effort, in my opinion, where we use the judicious bale grazing in the winter, but we also use the good intensive rotational grazing during the green months as well. So if I think it's always great to start small and if possible on a do-it-yourself level, meaning you go in there and you thin out your first acre or two and learn, because you will get a lot of valuable learning curve lessons from the experience of doing it yourself. And I think that pretty much all of us are capable of attacking it at that scale. Now, once you've uh, start to understand, all right, I cut trees down and now I have this giant pile of treetops and things I have to deal with, and how am I going to clean up that mess? Then you're ready maybe for the next scale, which is you call up a reputable consulting forester, or you reach out to your state forestry agency or your state forestry extension experts, or your soil and water conservation district. Here in the Northeast, many soil and water districts have forestry expertise on staff. And keep in mind, again, foresters grew up in this paradigm of keep the cows out of the woods, but I think that many of those foresters have opened their eyes and ears in the last 15 to 20 years and realized that silvopasturing can be a good thing. And at the end of the day, foresters are trained to help landowners achieve their management objectives. It's not really up to the forester to tell the farmer what they should or shouldn't do with their woods. It is up to them to say, well, if you do this and you do it in this way, here's what's going to happen. But foresters tend to be focused on the big tall plants, but I think that they realize that they can also figure out how to help grazers manage those smaller plants out there too. So if you're going to do it at a scale of probably much more than 10 to maybe 20 acres, you're you're going to want outside help, starting with a forester. The forester is really becomes your expert agent in the process, and you're not going to call up the local neighborhood friendly loggers and say, hey, come remove 3,000 tons of junk timber from my woods and pay me for it too, by the way. um, you know you might get away with calling up saying, hey, come remove the biggest juiciest saw timber trees in my woods and pay me whatever you tell me I should be happy with for those trees, and they will gladly take advantage of you doing that. But they're not going to come gut all the pulpwood, firewood type trees, which are, think of them as like the weed trees that we need to weed out of our woods. You're going to need a forester that's tapped into those types of contractors in those types of markets to make that happen. And it's a process that could take easily a year or more for that to all play out. Meaning that, and you can be doing this concurrently, like you can be planning to do your the do it yourself project this winter, but it's not too early to start that conversation, perhaps first with your local low cost or no cost forester, like your extension forester, your soil and water forester, your state forestry agency forester, who can provide some other valuable services, perhaps help you develop what we would think of as like a forest management plan, or even a silvopasture management plan. That's going to really force you to get your thoughts on the paper. It's not as daunting as it sounds. It also helps communicate to everybody else involved in the process what the objectives are, what the game plan is. And um, but for the forester to come in and get things to the point where then the pros can show up with a heavy metal and make mountains of pretty low value to no value trees disappear, that could take a while for it to happen. The longer you procrastinate on doing that, the longer it'll take to happen.
So from that, I guess simply put, I guess what I'm hearing would be the whole sort it, seed it, and scoot. Meaning sort out the trees you don't need, and then seed in some new forages, and then move quickly.
Yeah,
Try
you're
to
going to
avoid
need to do all
damage.
three of those things, because, and that's where I think a lot of people mistakenly think like, well, we're already doing silvopasture and we have the farm woodlot fenced in, the animals move through there, but what are they eating? There's probably, even though there might be a lot of green stuff in the understory, most of it is not nutritious or palatable to the animals. So the grazing value of that is very low. You'd almost be better off fencing the animals out of there, quite honestly, even though it might give them a little shade and such. And it's not, by the way, something that you don't necessarily get to the end point overnight. I always kind of jokingly tell my farmers, like, you guys want everything to happen in 5 months. If we foresters are happy when it happens in 50 years, and agroforestry is somewhere in the middle, including silvopasturing, where we probably can't wait decades for this to happen, but it's not going to happen in 1 or 2 growing seasons either. As an extension forester, if I start trying to sell farmers on an idea where they may have to wait 15, 20 years to start to see the fruits of their labor and investments, I'm going to lose them. They're just not going to buy into that. So when you think about that process that we just described, it's you probably want to recalibrate your expectations, you know, increase the time frame if you're coming at from the farmer side of the equation, and decrease your time frame if you're coming at from the forester side. And we probably want to start seeing some pretty productive silvopasture in 5 to 10 years, and we can certainly throw more at it to get that more instant gratification, but it's not going to be like thin seed and graze and everything's 100%. I just thought of like one of the frequently asked questions in silvopasture discussions is like, well, how many, how does this equate to my nice treeless pastures? Like, is it, 5 to 1, 1 to 1? I think silvopastures can be every bit as productive as treeless pastures. Even if we do have a little less solar energy reaching the ground, we're compensating in other ways, but you're not going to get to 100% parity again in like maybe just a couple of years. But for that matter, if you like reseed a pasture, it's not going to be that highly productive sod in 1 or 2 seasons either. It's going to take time. If you're starting with a fallow field of meadow, goldenrod or corn stubble, it's not going to be, you can reseed it. It's still not going to be what is good as like the well grazed pastures of that you've been nurturing for a decade or more either. So you'll get there, but you need to know what you're trying to get to, and you have to respect those steps. You won't get there if you're not doing enough thinning or enough density reduction in your trees, because you just won't have enough sunlight. Fortunately, cool season forages thrive in light shade. They actually do better in light shade than they do in open full sunlight, which is why they're cool season forages. Now, warm season forages, some of them do have considerable shade tolerance, many don't. That is like Bermuda grass, for example, just doesn't do shade. So if you're in an area where you're relying more on warm season perennials, ironically, one of the most shade tolerant grasses is um, it's one of the warm season grasses. They'll come to me. I mean, switchgrass, so. Eastern gamma grass, that actually is very shade tolerant, which you wouldn't think of. Eastern gamma grass is shade tolerant. Tall fescue is relatively shade tolerant. Reed canary grass, which to me is more of a warm season than a cool season, that is actually considered to be the most shade tolerant of the cool season grasses. But orchard grass, as the name implies, is quite shade tolerant. And I think over time we need to test and develop and trial more of our forages to select varieties that are better suited for silvopastures, but we just don't have the market for that yet to entice the plant breeders to do so, which is why I like working with what wants to come naturally. And in a typical farm woodlot, you've got stuff blowing in from all sides of what is doing fine out in your more open pastures. Now you're creating the conditions for it to come into your farm woodlands as well. And you need that. The tree harvesting or thinning, by the way, also creates that scarification, which is an important part of getting that soil seed bank to express itself. If you have heavy decomposing leaf or needle layer on the ground and you don't disturb that or stir that up, you're not, or you just broadcast seed on top of that, guess what? You're not going to get the forage plants to appear that you were hoping for.
Right. And that makes sense. Well, no, and I hate to say we're nearing here at the end. I really do appreciate you taking the time to, I guess, put some more clarification on it. Because like you said, silvopasturing has kind of been a word people have used of just putting grazers in the trees without what you described today. So I just really do appreciate that detail that you've added to the definition.
While I'm thinking of it, Sadie, I want to add, so there's a number of land grant schools that have some really good silvopasturing resources. And and I think that you're going to find similar information at all those sites, but Virginia Tech is kind of the mid-Atlantic go-to place for silvopasturing information. In the Midwest, it would be University of Missouri, their Center for Agroforestry. Here in the Northeast, if you type Cornell silvopasture, you'll find the stuff that we've been compiling there. And you're going to find that there's a lot of similarities between the stuff that Mizzou would be recommending versus Virginia Tech versus Cornell versus maybe some other institutions. We also have the National Agroforestry Center. They has good silvopasture information, but how to take that good information and adapt it in the context of your own farm. Obviously, that falls on us. And if you can find others in your neighborhood that are doing this, seek them out. Jump ahead in their learning curves too. I find farmers, especially grazers, to be extremely generous with their knowledge. And we don't have all the time in the day to have lengthy conversations about every little nuanced detail, but there's a lot of good practical experience out there to benefit from.
Well, and that was my last question, and you just answered it, was where to find more information and then where to find the support for it as well. So you covered that. But is there anything else that we absolutely need to know or that we missed? Because I know we could make this go for a while too.
Oh, we missed plenty, but I think now, we should all be aware of what the steps are to get started. Maybe we can chat again in the future and really get into some of the other details on what I think of as the benefits. We touched a little bit on shade and nutrition, but there's so much more. And I guess to not leave anybody in suspense, though, I would say that I've spent 30 plus years now thinking about silvopasturing, and I keep coming up with a ever longer list of all the good things about silvopasturing. The only maybe downside to it that I've ever come up with, besides if you do it poorly, obviously you can have some poor results, is that it does require us to be better managers. But I think any AGA member, anybody listening to this episode, they've already crossed that bridge. We're committed to doing better than mediocre management with our livestock and our grazing. So I think everybody listening is capable of being successful silvopasturing.
Oh, and I think it's so imperative if you have the trees, take care of them, because it's a pretty large mistake killing something that takes so long to mature. So
And replace.
Exactly. And so I think it's imperative to understand the key elements of silvopasturing, which, and you brought it up, we're going to have another Zoom call to get into that, the greater detail. But I think this was a really great kind of introduction for folks that might be thinking about it. But
it always kind of mystifies me. Now, I'm biased being a forester, but again, many of our farms, many of our ranches have quite a bit of trees out there. They might be in the form of windbreaks, they might be pretty significant chunks of forest, and yet it seems to be the most underappreciated parts of our farm landscapes. And I'm not saying that farmers, I'll just generalize us all as farmers, that we don't love our trees, we don't love our woods, but I think we totally underestimate the value and importance of those woods and what we can do to care for those woods. And I think silvopasturing is, somebody could look at it as like, well, you're doing something in there that's going to change things or potentially harm things. I would argue that many of our woods are in such a degraded state because of all the things that harm and kill our trees and our woods today, that silvopasturing is an opportunity to take action and put it back on the right track. I would challenge you to find a farm woodlot here in my neighborhood that isn't overrun with noxious invasive shrubs and just has a whole host of other issues that put into doubt the ability for that woods to be perpetuated or sustained over time. And I cannot think of a better way, both in terms of effectiveness and cost effectiveness, to rehabilitate and restore our farm woodlands than silvopasturing. But here's the catch. Again, you got to subscribe to doing it well. And many of our livestock farms here in New York, and by livestock farms, I really mean dairy and beef cattle farms, but the dairy cows here are mostly in barns. The beef cattle are typically on pasture during the growing season. Then we lock them down in the barns in the winter. Shame on us. Many of our beef cattle farmers are not what I think of as grazers. Like they don't even use the word grazing in their vocabulary. It's just like the pastures or the green warehouse to put the cows in. We'll feed them hay out there if they run out of grass, and we'll move them somewhere else when things get too bad out there. That is not the type of livestock farmer that's going to necessarily be successful silvopasturing, because it really does take a grazer's mindset to pull this off. But that shouldn't scare any of us away from saying like, all right, I got to do a good job here with my pasture management.
Oh yeah, which, like you said, fits in with our community very, very well. So, no, well, I do appreciate your time, and thank you for diving into this very large subject matter.
My wife likes to remind me that if I didn't work for Extension and get paid to talk about cows and trees, I would be doing it all day long anyhow. So this is this is a total pleasure for me, Sadie. Thanks for having me on. Um, I I'm happy that we've had opportunity to share a little bit of this and hopefully stimulate some people to think about this opportunity on their own farms.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, thank you, and we'll catch up soon.